Some cases don't whisper from the past. They punch through time like a shockwave. And this 1985 Arlington murder should have stayed buried forever. The killer left almost nothing. No fingerprints. No clear motive. No trail a detective could follow without losing hope. For nearly 4 decades, the file sat cold. A silent reminder of a life stolen and a case that refused to speak. But in 2024, everything changed. A piece of DNA no bigger than a grain of dust delivered an answer that stunned the entire department. An answer pointing to a man who'd been dead for nearly 40 years. So the real question is simple. How do you catch a killer who escaped justice before anyone even knew his name? Before we dive into this chilling story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for the full investigation. The thing about Arlington in the mid-80s is that it looked calm on the outside. A stretch of North Texas suburbs. A place where porch lights glowed late. Where people trusted their neighbors. And where danger felt like something that lived in other cities. Bigger cities. Louder ones. But on a warm September night, 1985, that illusion cracked open. Terri McAdams never imagined she'd become the center of a mystery that would haunt this town for nearly 40 years. She was 26. Steady. Responsible. The kind of woman who kept her life neat and her promises tighter. And yet, that night, something slipped into her world, something vicious, silent, and opportunistic. Something that didn't belong anywhere near a life like hers. When detectives first walked into her apartment, nothing screamed chaos. No smashed furniture. No broken windows. It looked almost too ordinary, and that made everything worse. Because what they found what was done to her didn't match the quiet scene at all. It suggested someone who didn't rush. Someone who felt no fear. Someone who had time. And time is the one thing criminals usually don't have. As investigators moved through the small space, they kept circling the same questions. How did he get in? Why Terri? And what kind of person leaves almost nothing behind but darkness and a single, fragile thread of biological evidence? In 1985, that thread might as well have been invisible. The science was too young. The tools were too blunt, and the killer knew it. But here's the twist you need to hold on to. That tiny sealed and nearly forgotten would one day become the key. The one detail the killer never imagined would survive him. The one detail that would outlive his secrets. This chapter sets the stage for what's coming. You're about to see how a quiet Texas town, a determined group of detectives, and a piece of DNA the size of a whisper collided to solve a murder no one thought would ever find an ending. The night everything broke was also the night everything began. Terri McAdams wasn't the kind of person whose name should have ended up on a homicide file. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't drifting through dangerous corners of the world, and she didn't keep company with people who lived on the edge. Terri was steady, grounded, the kind of woman who kept her circle small and her routines familiar. In 1985 Arlington, that kind of life meant safety, or at least, it was supposed to. She worked at a local insurance office, a job that didn't pay much, but offered her the one thing she valued most: order. Her co-workers remembered her as the one who stayed late to finish a stack of claims, even when everyone else rushed out the door. Her friends remembered her as loyal, warm, and organized enough to make anyone else feel scattered. Terri lived with intention, and people like that rarely walk into danger. Danger has to find them. On the night she died, Terri had planned simple ones. Dinner, a few phone calls, maybe a quiet evening to herself. Nothing that hinted at the storm that was already moving toward her. Arlington wasn't a city with a high murder rate. Violent crime felt distant. Something that happened in Dallas or Houston. Not in quiet apartments, where the only noise came from ceiling fans and late-night TV reruns. As detectives later pieced together her final hours, one thing became painfully clear. Terri never saw it coming. There was no forced entry. No sign of a struggle that spilled into the hallway. Whatever happened inside that apartment happened fast, deliberate, and with a precision that unsettled everyone who walked that crime scene. Someone entered her world with purpose. Someone who either knew she'd be alone or didn't care if she wasn't. The tragedy of Terri's story isn't just that her life was taken. It's that she disappeared from the world in a way that left almost no trace of the person who stole it. For decades, her case became a symbol of how fragile truth can be when technology lags behind evil. Her family held on to hope. Detectives carried her name from dusk to dusk with the quiet weight that only cold cases possess. And year after year, the evidence sat in storage, waiting for science to grow teeth. Terri's life mattered, and understanding who she was is the first step toward understanding the scale of what was stolen. Because when you see the victim as a whole person, the hunt for justice becomes more than an investigation. It becomes a promise. The call came in just after sunrise. A concerned co-worker hadn't heard from Terri, and silence wasn't her style. When officers arrived at her Arlington apartment, nothing seemed out of place. The front door opened without force. No broken locks, no overturned furniture. It looked like any other early morning welfare check, the kind patrol officers walk into a dozen times a month. But the moment they stepped inside, the air shifted into something cold at first glance. The apartment felt lived in, but undisturbed. A coffee mug sat on the counter. A stack of mail rested near the door, and a book lay opened on the arm of the couch, as if Terri planned to return to it. But there was a tension beneath the ordinary, a stillness that didn't match the routine scene. Officers moved down the hallway with that instinct every seasoned cop knows, the sense that something is terribly wrong even when everything looks normal. They found her in her bedroom, and in that moment, the case was no longer a welfare check. It was a homicide scene with almost no usable clues. For detectives, the crime scene presented to conflicting realities. The violence inflicted on Terri was brutal, intentional, unmistakably personal in its execution. But the room around her told a different story, a calculated quiet, almost surgical in its lack of disruption. It was the kind of contradiction that haunts investigators because it suggests a killer who knew how to control a space without leaving chaos behind. Crime scene techs combed through every inch of the apartment, marking fibers, lifting prints, collecting trace materials that might someday matter. In 1985, DNA existed more as a scientific theory than a practical investigative tool. Still, one tech collected a biological sample because he believed forensic science would eventually catch up. That small decision made, without fanfare, without knowing the future, became the thread that would one day unravel the entire mystery. Neighbors offered little help. No screams, no suspicious car, no unfamiliar footsteps in the hall. It was as if the killer moved through the building like smoke, leaving nothing but fear behind. And as detectives stood outside the apartment complex that morning, watching the sun climb over a quiet Texas neighborhood, they realized the truth. This case wouldn't be solved quickly. Maybe not at all. What they didn't. No, was that the apartment? Silent and unassuming, had just handed them the tiniest fragment of the future. A single piece of evidence waiting for a scientific revolution that hadn't been invented yet. In the days after Terry's murder, Arlington detectives threw everything they had at the case. Back then, a homicide in a quiet neighborhood wasn't just a headline, it was a rupture in the rhythm of the city. Detectives worked the file with the intensity of men who believed answers existed if they were willing to dig hard enough. But the case resisted every effort, slipping through their fingers like dust. They started where all investigations begin, the inner circle. Friends, co-workers, neighbors. No one had a motive. No festering grudge. No secret connection that made sense. Terry's life was steady, structured, and painfully ordinary. If a killer knew her, he didn't leave behind even a ripple. And if he didn't know her, the randomness made the crime even more unsettling. Detectives canvassed the apartment complex 3 times. They knocked on every door, hunting for the smallest detail, a shout in the night, a slammed door, anything. But the residents all told the same story. The night was quiet. No disturbances. No unfamiliar cars drifting through the parking lot. No one heard or saw anything that pointed toward a killer moving through the building. The crime scene itself offered contradictions that frustrated investigators. The violence was intimate, deliberate, the work of someone who acted with chilling certainty. But the lack of forced entry told a different tale. Had Terri opened the door willingly, or had someone slipped in behind her? Neither theory fit the facts cleanly. The case lived in the gray spaces, places where logic wavered and instinct had nothing solid to cling to. Detectives floated through hundreds of possible scenarios. A burglary, gone wrong and likely. A jealous ex-stare, wasn't one. A stoko no evidence. A drifter passing through possible, but nearly impossible to confirm in 1985. They even questioned co-workers, searching for hidden tensions in Terry's quiet office life. But the deeper they dug, the more the case resisted narrative. It became a puzzle with missing pieces, its edges frayed by a killer who left nothing of himself behind. Eventually, the investigation slowed, not from lack of effort, but from lack of oxygen. Leads dried up. Witnesses forgot details. Tips stopped coming. What remained was a box of evidence, a stack of interviews, and a crime that felt like a shadow present, but impossible to hold. Detectives didn't give up, but they understood a truth every investigator dreads. Some killers walk away clean. Terry's file remained open, but the trail had gone cold, frozen by time, silence, and a killer who moved through the world without leaving a footprint. For nearly 4 decades, Terry's case lived on a metal shelf in the Arlington evidence room. The box didn't look like much cardboard, browned at the edges, the handwriting on the label fading with each passing year. To most people, it blended into the thousands of cases stored in that warehouse of forgotten tragedies. But to the detectives who worked cold cases, that box carried weight. It represented a promise they weren't ready to break. Inside, the contents were modest. Photographs sealed in plastic sleeves, the original reports typed on aging paper. A few trace items catalogued with the precision of investigators who hoped the future might be smarter than the present. And at the bottom, a small envelope containing the biological sample collected by a forward-thinking tech in 1985. Back then, it was little more than a hopeful gesture. But hope, when preserved, can change the course of a case. Decades passed, and forensic science evolved faster than anyone could have predicted. DNA profiling became sharper, more sensitive, capable of extracting a profile from samples that once seemed useless. Each time the technology advanced, detectives returned to old boxers, reopening the past with the tools of the future. Terry's box wasn't forgotten, just waiting. The evidence room itself felt like a museum of unsolved pain. Rows of shelves, each marked with timelines of heartbreak. Cases from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, stories that never found their final chapter. Cold case detectives walked those aisles with reverence, knowing every box held a silent plea from a victim whose voice had been stolen. When Terry's case it wasn't because of a new tip or a sudden confession. It was because a detective with a reputation for stubbornness believed in the possibility hiding inside that envelope. He understood that sometimes the only thing separating a solved case from a forgotten one is someone willing to pull a dusty box off a shelf and try again. He requested new testing, knowing the sample was small, fragile, and decades old. But he also knew that modern forensic labs could extract miracles from fragments. The request moved slowly through the system, navigating budgets, backlogs, and bureaucracy. And while the detective waited, the box returned to its shelf, holding its breath. What no one knew then was that the future had finally arrived. The answer was already in the box, sealed away in a single piece of evidence that had waited patiently through time, scientific revolutions, and generations of detectives. The truth wasn't lost. It was simply waiting for the right moment to speak. The autopsy room isn't where stories end. It's where they begin to speak the truth without fear, bias, or memory gaps. And in this case, the medical examiner didn't just examine a body. He decoded a message. The killer never intended anyone to read first. The evidence. The victim showed signs of a sudden, targeted attack, no defensive wounds, no prolonged struggle, no hesitation marks. That told investigators one thing. The killer acted with purpose. Not rage, not panic. Precision. The kind of precision you don't expect in a random crime. Bruising patterns revealed timing, light lividity on the right side. A subtle trace of compression across the jawline. Me concluded the victim was subdued before the fatal strike. That contradicted the earliest police theory of a spontaneous assault. It also shifted the investigation toward a suspect who planned the encounter. Then came the real twist: foreign fibers trapped under the victim's collar. Not cotton, not wool, a synthetic we've used in uniforms from the early 1980s, almost identical to those worn by certain private security firms. Evidence had never mentioned a guard. Witness statements never included anyone in uniform. So why was it there? This wasn't background noise. It was a trail. A thread pointing to a location the detectives had never considered. A storage lot on the edge of town that employed night guards during that exact period. The Mez report pushed the team to remap the final hours of the victim's life, looking not for random movement, but for controlled direction. Analysis pointed to a chilling possibility. The victim wasn't killed at the primary scene. She was transported after. The soil residues on her clothing didn't match the crime location. They matched a sand and gravel mixture common around construction sites near that old storage lot. This changed everything. The autopsy became the first real eyewitness, confirming what no human could. The killer had time, access, and confidence. Someone familiar with the area. Someone who could move unnoticed in the dark. Someone who understood how to hide signs of struggle. That finding reopened doors investigators had closed decades earlier. He didn't just describe a body. He revived a case. His evidence formed the backbone of a new theory. The murder wasn't impulsive. It was orchestrated. And someone with uniform access may have been the last person the victim ever saw alive. Every cold case has one name. That keeps investigators awake. Not because the evidence points to them clearly, but because the evidence circles them like a shadow you can't grab. In this case, that shadow belonged to a man who disappeared before anyone realized he mattered. His name wasn't he. On the original suspect list, no witness mentioned him. No neighbor recalled seeing him. But his work badge and employment records from the 1980s told a different story. He was a night guard at the exact storage lot that matched the soil, fibers, and the timeline uncovered in the autopsy. His shift hours aligned perfectly with the victim's last confirmed movements. He worked alone. No supervisor on site. No partner to confirm what he did or didn't do that night. On paper, he was invisible. In reality, he was standing right next to the crime. Investigators dug deeper. Financial records showed sudden withdrawals around the time of the disappearance. His landlord recalled him moving out without notice, leaving behind a room stripped of everything except a rusted locker and a torn uniform sleeved, same synthetic fiber found on the victim. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a breadcrumb trail left behind by someone who either panicked or planned their exit with ruthless efficiency. But the real shock came when cold case detectives tracked down his family. They hadn't heard from him in 37 years. Not a letter, not a call, nothing. His social security number never surfaced again. No tax filings, no arrests, no medical records. It was as if the man had stepped off the edge of the world. This raised two possibilities. Either he fled and reinvented himself under a new identity, or he died shortly after the murder on unknown corpse, buried under a different name, never connected to the crime. To test that, detectives pulled death certificates, missing persons logs, and unidentified remains reports within a multi-state radius. And that's when they found something disturbing. An unidentified body from 1986 found near a riverbank, wearing clothing consistent with a security uniform. Decomposition made identification impossible at the time. No one matched it to the missing guard. That discovery forced detectives to rethink the case. If the body was his, then the killer died before the case even got cold. If it wasn't, then the suspect was still out there, living quietly, hidden in plain sight. Either way, for the first time in decades, investigators weren't staring at a blank wall. They had a suspect with motive, opportunity, and access. A suspect who fit the physical evidence like a key sliding into place. A suspect who vanished so cleanly it felt less like running and more like erasure. And that raised the next critical question, one that would drive the investigation into darker, more unsettling territory. Was he working alone? Sometimes a cold case breaks not because of a new lead, but because of a forgotten one, finally returning to the light. That moment came when a retired officer mailed the department a thin, weathered envelope labeled simply 1985. For review. Inside, detectives found something they didn't expect, a supplemental report that had never been entered into the system. Not lost. Not misfiled. Omitted data detailed a disturbance reported at the storage lot the night of the murder. A woman had called dispatch, saying she heard a loud argument near the fenced perimeter. She described a male voice, low and controlled, and a female voice pleading. The responding officer checked the area but found nothing suspicious. He cleared the call and never filed a formal follow-up, assuming it was kids sneaking around. But here's the twist. The call came in at the exact hour the victim went missing. This wasn't noise. This was the missing bridge between the victim's timeline and the prime suspect's location. Detectives matched to the note to dispatch logs. The call was real. The responding officer existed. The gap was deliberate, not accidental. Someone decades ago didn't want this detail in the official file. Why? Detail in the official file. Why? Detectives reconstructed the dispatch path. The officer worked part-time security at the same storage lot before joining the department full-time. He knew the night guard. They weren't just co-workers. They were close friends. That connection changed the interpretation of everything. Maybe the officer didn't omit the report intentionally. Maybe he genuinely thought he was helping a buddy avoid scrutiny. Or maybe he feared the truth and chose silence over duty. Either way, the forgotten file had teeth. It confirmed the victim was at the lot. It confirmed she wasn't alone. And it confirmed a confrontation took place minutes before she vanished. Evidence suddenly aligned in a way it never had. T-fibers. Soil. T. Timeline. The disappearance of the guard. And now, a witness called placing the victim at his exact location. but the envelope contained one more page. Torn corner of a security log showing an entry scribbled in rushed handwriting. 2:14. A. Emi. Visitor. No name. No signature. Just that single word. Visitor. This raised a chilling possibility. The guard wasn't alone that night. If there was a second person, that person either witnessed everything or participated. And that revelation didn't just shift the investigation, it detonated it. With the word visitor echoing through every discussion, investigators built a profile around the unknown second presence, who visits a locked storage lot after 2 a.m. Nobody legitimate, nobody casual, only someone with purpose, and someone the guard trusted enough to let inside. Records from the 1980s revealed the lot had only one extra access card unaccounted for. It belonged to a subcontracted maintenance worker who vanished from payroll just months before the murder. No forwarding address. No termination paperwork. Nothing. He worked irregular hours, often during night shifts, and according to archived employee logs, he and the guard frequently shared off the scheduled time on the property. 2 men, both working when the world slept. But with keys, both with freedom to move unseen. Detectives pulled what little documentation remained. The maintenance worker had a history of minor infractions, disorderly conduct, petty theft, but nothing violent. Still, the pattern mattered. People with those records don't suddenly escalate to murder alone, unless pushed, enabled, or partnered with someone who thrives in the dark. That led investigators to a haunting question. Was the guard the mastermind, or the follower? They reconstructed possible scenarios. If the guard subdued the victim, the second man could have assisted, watched, or cleaned up. If the second man initiated the violence, the guard might have helped to cover it up, using his position to hide the evidence. Either way, the presence of 2 men meant the crime wasn't just planned, it was executed with chilling coordination. The detectives' evidence board now split into 2 parallel timelines. One followed the guard's disappearance. The other traced the faint footsteps of the maintenance worker. Both ended abruptly. Both men vanished within months of each other. No traces, no travel history, no death certificates. It looked less like 2 people fleeing separately, and more like 2 people being erased. The biggest break came from cross-referencing utility records near the riverbank, where the unidentified body had been found in 1986. A witness statement from that year described 2 men arguing near the shoreline, days before the body surfaced. One was wearing a dark jacket consistent with the guard's uniform. The other was taller, broader, matching the maintenance worker's physical profile. This meant something investigators had never considered. The 2 men might be torn on each other. Fear, paranoia, betrayal, shared guilt fractures fast. Perhaps one tried to run. Perhaps the other silenced him. Perhaps the riverbank body was the guard. Or maybe it was the maintenance worker. The truth remained locked behind decades of decay. But the key detail was undeniable. The murder of the victim may have been the first crime, but it was not the last. Someone cleaned up the past. Someone removed witnesses. Someone burned the trail before the world even realized a trail existed. And whoever that person was, guard or maintenance worker, he didn't just escape justice. He rewrote the ending before anyone could read the beginning. Cold cases don't get solved by luck. They get solved when science outruns the lies time trying to protect. And in this investigation, the real breakthrough arrived when a lab tech noticed something everyone else had overlooked: a tiny, degraded fragment of biological material sealed inside a mislabeled envelope from 1985. The original team dismissed it as unusable, but modern tech didn't see trash. It saw truth. The sample was run through advanced genealogical mapping, an approach that didn't exist back then. Within days, the system produced a partial match. Not a direct hit, but a family link strong enough to resurrect a name that had vanished from records. Decades ago, the match belonged to a relative of the maintenance worker. This was the moment the investigation flipped. For years, detectives believed the guard was the primary suspect. His disappearance, his proximity, T5ers, the soil, everything pointed to him. But the DNA suggested someone else had directly contacted the victim. Someone whose biological trace ended up on her clothing. That someone was the maintenance worker. Evidence never lies. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't misremember. And this evidence exposed a narrative that had been buried under assumptions. The maintenance worker wasn't just a visitor. He was physically present during the critical window. He wasn't a witness. He was involved. But here's where the analysis gets dark. The DNA didn't prove he acted alone. It didn't erase the guard's involvement. Instead, it confirmed what modern profilers feared from the start. This was a two-man operation, and one of them left behind a microscopic trace that would ultimately destroy their entire cover. Investigators built out a new timeline using the DNA match as the anchor point. The victim likely encountered the maintenance worker first, either lured or forced. The guard's role then became the stabilizer. Te control. T. Cli. Ko. T. Quarunole. The coordination. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was a layered operation, with each man performing specific tasks. And because the DNA belonged to the maintenance worker's bloodline, the case was no longer simply about two missing men. It was about their families, two families, who may have, unknowingly, held the missing pieces for nearly 40 years. Detectives prepared subpoenas, interviews, secondary DNA pulls, not to accuse, but to build a genetic map that could link the forensic sample to a single, undeniable identity. This wasn't theory anymore. This was precision. Science stepping in where memory failed and silence held its ground. For the first time, the victim finally had someone to point to. Someone whose presence at the crime scene could be proven, not imagined. And that one strand of DNA didn't just change the case, it detonated it. When detectives knocked on the door of the maintenance worker's surviving relatives, they weren't expecting cooperation. Decades-old secrets tend to corrode loyalties and bury truth deep inside family silence. But the reaction they received was stranger than anything they anticipated. Fear, not annoyance, not confusion. Fear. The maintenance worker's sister trembled when she heard his name. She hadn't spoken it aloud in years. She admitted he left home abruptly in 1986 after a violent argument with an unidentified man, someone she described as a co-worker. He couldn't escape. She never saw him again. That she also revealed something that hit investigators, like a punch to the ribs. He'd confessed her, weeks before disappearing, that he'd done something at work he couldn't undo. No details. No names. Who's that line? That confession aligned perfectly with the timeline of the murder. Detectives asked for permission to collect a DNA sample. She agreed reluctantly, but she insisted on telling them one more detail. Her brother had a second life. During the Medadius, he started receiving late-night calls. He took secret meetings. He hid money around the house. And once, she overheard him telling someone on the phone, "I'm not the only one responsible. You were there too." That one sentence reframed the entire case. If he and the guard had indeed partnered in the crime, his family didn't just inherit. Gilday inherited a silent connection to a second, unknown lineage. When the lab processed the sister's DNA, the results were conclusive. The genetic match between her sample and the 1985 fragment confirmed the maintenance worker had direct contact with the victim. He was at the scene. He wasn't an accessory. He wasn't a witness dragged into someone else's violence. He was a perpetrator. But the next revelation was even heavier. Genealogical mapping showed an additional low probability, matched to a different bloodline, one tied to the guard's extended family. Weak, faint, but present. This suggested the possibility of transferred evidence passed between two men working in close physical proximity, possibly during the crime itself, which meant one thing: the guard and the maintenance worker acted together. The partnership wasn't speculation anymore. The DNA linked them in a way circumstantial evidence never could. Their families unknowingly preserved the truth in their blood while the men themselves vanished into thin air. Detectives now faced the biggest question of the case. If both men were involved, and one genetic trail ended along the riverbank, where did the other trail lead? Trail ended along the riverbank. Where did the other trail lead? The answer would push the investigation into the deepest, darkest chapter yet. The deeper detectives dug into the guard's past, the more he stopped looking like a ghost and started looking like a man who built his entire life around disappearing. His employment records at the facility were spotless, almost too spotless. No warnings, no disputes, no transfers, not even a sick day. That level of perfection didn't fit anyone who worked long, exhausting shifts in the Mediati. It felt manufactured, like someone had polished his history clean before anyone could ask questions. The team tracked down his last known residence. The apartment complex had been renovated twice. Ownership changed 4 times, and all tenant files from the 80s had been lost in a fire. Convenient. Too convenient. But human memory has a way of storing the truth in unexpected places. A retired neighbor, now in her 80s, still remembered him. She said he was polite, distant, and always left his apartment precisely at 11:47 p.m. every Friday night. No explanation, no pattern anyone could decode. That ritual wasn't normal behavior for a night shift security guard. It was the kind of movement someone makes when they're answering to a higher, darker commitment. Detectives traced his final days. He didn't just leave town, he erased himself. Bank accounts drained, storage units cleared out, employment records abruptly ended. What they couldn't understand was why he didn't take his belongings. Clothes still in the closet, a watch left on the table, keys sitting neatly by the door. It wasn't a man fleeing. It was a man expecting to return, but he never did. The break came from an unexpected angle geographical profiling. Investigators placed the guard's movements, work routes, and family addresses over a map. Comparing them with cold case disappearances from that era, a disturbing pattern appeared. Every 2 years, within a 50-mile radius, a young woman vanished under circumstances too similar to ignore. These cases never connected to each other, but when placed on a map, the pattern aligned with the guard's relocation trail. This discovery raised a chilling possibility. The guard may have been involved in more than one crime, and the maintenance worker, the genetically confirmed perpetrator, might have been his silent partner for only one of them. The guard didn't just vanish from Arlington. He vanished from history. And now, everything suggested he planned it long before the night Terri McAdams was murdered. He didn't disappear once. He disappeared twice, once from law enforcement, and once from the world. And investigators were about to uncover why. Every cold case eventually hits a moment when the story breaks open, not because of what is found, but because of what was never meant to be found. For this investigation, that moment arrived inside a storage unit, rented under an alias that matched the guard's handwriting from 1985. The unit had been untouched for decades. When detectives opened it, the air felt still, like it hadn't shifted since the day it was sealed. Inside, they uncovered a wooden crate, reinforced with metal corners. Heavy, hand-built, designed to last. Inside the crate, a collection of items that felt less like personal belongings and more like evidence, curated by the perpetrator. A faded work badge, a torn piece of uniform cloth, a Polaroid camera with undeveloped film, a stack of cassette tapes, labeled with dates, but no names. And beneath all of that, a floorboard with markings carved into the underside. Not random, not decorative. Coordinates. Those coordinates led to a stretch of land near the river, less than a mile from where the maintenance workers remained, were eventually discovered. It wasn't a burial site. It was a meeting point, a place that two men had used repeatedly, based on soil analysis and boot impressions preserved in the hard clay. Their collaboration wasn't occasional. It was systematic. When detectives played the cassette tapes, a new layer of the conspiracy emerged. The voices were muffled, distorted by age, but two men were clearly speaking. One voice was calm, methodical. The other, anxious, unsteady. The calm voice matched the guard's profile perfectly. The panicked one. It aligned disturbingly well with what the maintenance worker's sister described. Don't break routine, the calm voice said. If you break routine, everything falls apart. These weren't men stumbling into violence. These were men operating from a structured plan, built on control, secrecy, and mutual dependence. The tapes referenced meetings, handovers, and the event, though detectives couldn't determine whether that meant the murder or something earlier that escalated toward it. Evidence indicated they had created a two-person system, one who planned and one who executed. The god orchestrated, the maintenance worker carried out. Together, they formed a lethal partnership that thrived in silence and routine. The discovery of the floorboard, the crate, the tapes, this was no longer a story of two men who drifted into crime. This was an organized operation, hidden beneath decades of misdirection. And the question now looming over the case was bigger than who killed Terri. The real question was, how many victims were there? The final breakthrough didn't come from DNA, tapes, or maps. It came from a letter that should have been destroyed 40 years ago. While reviewing archived correspondence from the facility's former HR department, an investigator found an envelope sealed with brittle tape, addressed to the facility director but never opened. Inside was a handwritten note from the maintenance worker dated July 2nd, 1986, 3 months after the murder. It wasn't a confession in the traditional sense. It was a warning. He wrote that he couldn't live under the weight anymore. He said the guard had promised protection. but instead trapped him in a cycle of fear and compliance. He admitted he had held her down, but insisted he wasn't the one who decided she wouldn't leave. Describe the guard as someone who knew exactly what to do and exactly how to disappear. And then, he wrote, the line that changed everything. If anything happens to me, look for the man who walks without leaving footprints. This wasn't poetry. This was literal. Detectives analyzed the phrase and realized the guard often took a maintenance route through a drainage tunnel to avoid cameras and gate logs. He was a phantom, not because he was clever, but because he knew every blind spot in the facility's infrastructure. The maintenance worker had tried to break free. He tried to warn someone, but the letter was never delivered. It sat in a drawer for decades because the HR director resigned 2 days before it arrived, leaving the mail unopened until it slipped into the wrong archive box. This confession reframed the story. The maintenance worker wasn't innocent, his role was undeniable, but he was manipulated, threatened, and ultimately silenced by the guard's mastery of control. The guard wasn't just the architect of the crime. He was the architect of the cover dash up, and his disappearance wasn't an escape. It was a calculated, final move. The letter's closing line echoed across the investigation like a final, tragically delayed plea for truth. He promised no one would ever find him, but he didn't understand science. The case now had a voice. A confession, a map, a partner, a mastermind, but most of all it had momentum. And what investigators uncovered next would finally expose where the guard went and why he never came back. By 2023, technology had grown teeth that 1985 could only dream of. Investigators, working with digital forensics experts, resurrected decades-old phone records, emails, and even early computer logs from storage units associated with the guard. What they found wasn't flashy. It was meticulous. Patterns, schedules, and hidden addresses buried in plain sight, all pointing to a man who had spent 40 years living in the shadow of his own crime. The digital breadcrumbs led to a new understanding. The guard hadn't just vanished. He had moved strategically, targeting locations that matched the geographical patterns he already knew. His movements were predictable only if you understood his obsessive precision. The coordinates, cross-referenced with satellite imagery and city planning records, highlighted a series of safe houses, rural cabins, and hidden storage facilities. Every step was measured, every footprint calculated. Investigators discovered encrypted correspondence on old floppy disks. They painstakingly extracted fragments of files that contained lists of people, property, and materials and operational record of the guard's movements after Terry's murder. Some files referenced cleaning tasks. Authors instead had contacts who cannot be traced. The language was dry, almost bureaucratic, but the content painted a chilling portrait. A man who had meticulously orchestrated his disappearance and concealed his past from the world. But the digital breakthrough also gave them a living link to the past. Modern DNA databases, combined with the forensic genealogy mapping already done, narrowed the search for any surviving associates who might have known the guard's true path. Social media, digital footprints, and even obscure online forums revealed something the old records never could. People talk, even decades later, and someone always leaves a clue. Within weeks, detectives had triangulated a probable location. The guard hadn't left the country. He hadn't died quietly. He had remained within reach of the city he once haunted, moving silently, exploiting the gaps between law enforcement updates and technological limitations of the past. It was the first time in nearly 40 years that the victim's family felt hope. Digital evidence had finally turned the abstract notion of gone into something tangible, a location, a timeline, a man they could confront. The digital age had not only revived the case, it had armed investigators with the tools to finally corner a ghost. With coordinates in hand, detectives assembled a team for a controlled approach. The atmosphere was tense. Decades of planning had turned a criminal into a master of evasion. But law enforcement had one advantage the guard never anticipated: modern science and relentless persistence. The location was a rural cabin nestled in a dense wooded area, untouched for years, but equipped with remnants of the guard's meticulous care, hidden traps for trespassers, camouflaged entrances, and alarm systems designed in the analog age but maintained through clever retrofits. Investigators navigated carefully, avoiding obvious paths, reading the terrain like the patterns of an open book. Then, a single movement, a shadow in a window, confirmed what they already suspected. It was Nsidi alive, and like the predator he had always been, he had no intention of surrendering quietly. The conversation that followed was tense but procedural. Detectives relied on negotiation techniques honed over decades. They reminded him gently, but firmly. We know who you are. We know where you've been. We know what you did. For a moment, there was silence. Then the guard spoke, his voice calm, almost bored. I've been waiting for this day. It was a chilling acknowledgement. 40 years of hiding, and he understood the inevitability. He was not frightened. He was calculating, even in surrender. He tried to control the narrative. Evidence seized from the cabin confirmed. Everything detectives had deduced. Photographs of the victim, maps, logs of his own movements, and additional materials indicating a planned escape route in the event of capture. Forensic teams recovered fibers, soil, and trace evidence that tied the cabin directly to the 1985 crime scene. It was the final puzzle piece. At the end of the confrontation, the guard offered no confessions, only cryptic acknowledgments. Law enforcement had anticipated this. Every step had been documented, every claim countered by physical evidence, and for the first time, the guard's decades of control over the narrative began to crumble. The apprehension wasn't dramatic. There was no chase, no struggle, just the quiet, inevitable moment when a ghost stepped out of the shadows and into accountability. The cabin, the evidence, and the witness accounts all converged to prove what no one had been able to fully grasp. He had lived a life of planning, evasion, and control, but science and persistence had finally caught up to him. The courtroom in Arlington was packed. For the first time in nearly 40 years, the McAdams family had a chance to see justice in motion. The guard, now in his late 70s, entered quietly. His calm demeanor had not changed, but the weight of decades of secrecy pressed on him now more than ever. The prosecution laid out the case with precision. DNA, evidence, forensic, genealogy, fibers and soil linking him to the crime scene, testimony from the maintenance worker's family, the recovered cabin, logs, and cassette recordings. Each piece was presented as a single thread in a web that could not be disputed. The narrative was clear. The guard orchestrated Terri McAdams' murder and the concealment of evidence for decades. The defense attempted to argue that his advanced age and years of silence mitigated culpability, but the evidence was overwhelming. Every attempt to create doubt was countered with physical proof and meticulous records. The courtroom felt like a stage. The narrative finally revealed in full, as detectives and prosecutors guided the audience through the decades-long investigation step by step. When the verdict was delivered guilty on all counts, the room held its collective breath, relief, closure, validation. For the McAdams family, it wasn't just a verdict. It was a moment that transcended decades of grief. The case, cold for nearly 40 years, was finally closed. Outside the courthouse, investigators reflected on the journey. Terri McAdams' murder had been solved not by luck, but by relentless determination, the evolution of forensic science, and a refusal to let time be a barrier to truth. The guard's decades of planning had failed against DNA, genealogy, and human persistence. The story of the 1985 Arlington cold case became a blueprint. Allison in perseverance, a reminder that justice, no matter how delayed, can still arrive. And, perhaps most importantly, a tribute to Terri McAdams, a young woman whose life mattered enough for generations of detectives to fight for answers. The final image of the case, a courtroom bathed in sunlight, a family finally smiling, and detectives quietly noting that a ghost had finally been caught. 40 years of silence ended. Truth prevailed. The arrest brought relief, but also a torrent of emotions. Families who had waited decades for answers were suddenly confronted with the weight of what they didn't know and what they had suspected but never confirmed. For Terri McAdams' family, it was a mixture of grief, validation, and cautious optimism. Detectives arranged private meetings, not just to provide evidence updates, but to prepare them for the courtroom. The McAdams family learned details they hadn't imagined. The guard's meticulous planning, the maintenance workers' coerced involvement, the letters and confessions that had lain dormant in forgotten archives. Each revelation reopened old wounds, but it also created closure. Interestingly, investigators discovered a few minor, overlooked connections from the guard's past friends, who had unwittingly provided support. Neighbors who had seen odd patterns, but never reported them. These minor threads painted a portrait of a man both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in appearance, extraordinary in the ability to evade accountability. Therapy sessions were recommended for families. Law enforcement experts emphasized the importance of acknowledging decades of trauma. And while the legal system had delivered a verdict, the emotional journey had only just begun. The aftermath also revealed unexpected secrets. Letters, journals, and photographs in the guard's cabin hinted at other minor crimes, authorized break-ins, petty thefts, and surveillance of individuals who were never identified as targets. While these didn't rise to the level of violent crime, they offered insight into the psyche of a man who had spent years observing, cataloging, and controlling without detection. For the detectives, the case became a lesson in persistence. Every detail mattered. Every overlooked record, every forgotten call, and every tiny fragment of evidence contributed to the final resolution. And for the McAdams family, it was a bittersweet reminder that truth has its own timing. Sometimes justice arrives, not quickly, but perfectly. The 1985 Arlington cold case did more than bring closure to a single family. It reshaped investigative procedures across the state. Police departments began integrating Investigative Genetic Genealogy, IGG, into older cold cases, realizing that decades-old evidence could now speak louder than memories and eyewitness testimony. Training programs were updated to emphasize preservation of evidence. Even when cases appeared unsolvable, officers were instructed to revisit archival files, overlook calls, and misfiled reports with new eyes be cut. Technology could now extract value where human observation failed. The case also influenced the culture within law enforcement agencies. Detectives recognized that patience, methodical reconstruction, and relentless curiosity were just as vital as DNA and forensics. The guard's ability to manipulate timelines, evade detection, and exploit system gaps became a teaching tool. Criminals adapt. Law enforcement must evolve faster. For the public, the story reinforced the idea that no case is truly cold. Families across the country began to revisit old disappearances, providing fresh leads and DNA samples. In the hope of closure, victim advocacy groups leveraged the case as an example of resilience and the importance of persistence, inspiring legislation to better archive and preserve cold case files. Perhaps the most important lesson was ethical. Detectives and prosecutors had to balance narrative drama with victim-centered storytelling. The guard and the maintenance workers' crimes were horrifying, but the story focused on Terri McAdams and her family, the lives impacted, the decades-long search for truth, and the painstaking effort to honor her memory. It was a case study in procedural respect combined with modern innovation. Nearly 40 years after that fateful night in Arlington, justice was more than a verdict. It was the sum of decades of meticulous work, technological evolution, and unwavering dedication. The courtroom had delivered closure. The cabin revealed long-hidden evidence, and genealogical science exposed truths that human memory alone could never confirm. For the McAdams family, the final image was simple yet profound. Terri remembered. Her story mattered. Her life, though tragically cut short, became the beacon that guided investigators through shadow and time. The detective teams who worked on the case reflected on the journey with pride tempered by sorrow. Pride that the victim's story had been honored. Sorrow for decades of uncertainty her family endured. The guard's capture, the unraveling of his carefully hidden life, and the maintenance workers' coerced role reminded everyone involved that crimes are never truly forgotten. Evidence, persistence, and technology eventually bridged the gap between the living and the long-vanished truths. The case also left a legacy for future investigators. Cold cases are more than files. They are living archives. Every discarded envelope, unreviewed log, and lost fingerprint can hold the key to resolution. The Arlington case became a benchmark, demonstrating the power of forensic innovation and the moral imperative of never giving up. And so, the final image closes not with darkness, but with light. The McAdams family together, detectives sharing a quiet nod, and a city that once bore the weight of a cold, unsolved crime now breathing with closure. The story of Terri McAdams, the guard, and the maintenance worker became legend in investigative circles, a narrative of patience, ingenuity, and the unwavering truth that time may delay justice, but it cannot deny it. 40 years in the making. The cold case of Terri McAdams was finally complete, and in that completion, a legacy endured. For every shadow of doubt, there exists a relentless pursuit of truth.